The Curse of Factory. Number 42. In a small town in the United States, there stood an aging factory, known as Factory Number 42nd. Decades ago, it was the heart of the town, buzzing with workers and machines. But over time, the factory's reputation turned dark. Rumors spread about workers disappearing, strange voices echoing in the halls, and a curse tied to the building. Most dismissed the tales as urban legends, but the factory's night shift was always the hardest position to fill. James Carter, a middle-aged man struggling to make ends meet, recently started working the night shift there. He wasn't one for superstition and laughed off the stories he heard from coworkers. He needed the job and couldn't afford to be scared off by ghost stories. One stormy night, James drove through the pouring rain to start his shift. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the factory's crumbling facade. As he entered, the stale metallic air seemed heavier than usual. His job was simple: monitor the conveyor belt and ensure the machines operated smoothly. The rhythmic clanking of the machinery filled the space, but as the night wore on, James began to notice strange things. At first it was faint, a soft, muffled cry that seemed to come from the far end of the factory. He paused, thinking it was just the storm outside, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind, it was a voice, low and pleading, like someone calling for help. "Hello?" James called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. No one responded. Uneasy, he grabbed his flashlight and followed the sound. It led him to a section of the factory that hadn't been used in years. The air grew colder as he stepped into the dark corridor, the walls stained with rust and time. At the end of the hallway was an old storage room. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the room was filled with broken equipment and dust-covered shelves. In the center of the room was an old locker, slightly ajar. The cries seemed to come from inside. With trembling hands, James pulled the locker door open. Inside, he found a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn. The cries stopped abruptly. Confused, he picked up the journal and flipped through its pages. The journal belonged to a man named John Harper, a worker who had disappeared years ago. The entries were disturbing. "The factory isn't normal. I hear voices at night. Shadows move when no one is there. They say the factory is cursed, and it demands something. It demands us." The final entry read, "If you find this, leave while you can. It's too late for me." Before James could process what he'd read, the lights flickered and the power went out. The factory was plunged into darkness. His flashlight flickered as he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. A cold, heavy presence filled the room. Slowly, he turned around and froze. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadow, its glowing, hollow eyes fixed on him. The figure whispered, its voice like a raspy wind, "You shouldn't be here." Panic surged through James as he backed away. The machinery outside roared to life, though no one was operating it. A crimson liquid began dripping from one of the machines, pooling on the factory floor. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. James bolted for the exit, but the doors wouldn't budge. The figure appeared again, now closer, blocking his path. "Leave," he commanded, "or stay forever." James screamed as the figure reached for him. The next morning, the storm had passed. The factory floor was silent. Security guards found James slumped against the main doors, unconscious. When he awoke, he was pale and trembling, clutching the journal in his hands. James quit that day and left town, but the factory locals claim that on stormy nights, the sounds of machines and ghostly cries can still be heard. Some even say the shadowy figure with glowing eyes watches from the windows, waiting for its next victim. The Midnight Storm at Ridgeway Gas Station. Ridgeway Gas Station sat on the edge of a desolate highway, far from the bustling cities of California. Surrounded by rolling hills and dense woods, the station was often quiet, with only a few cars stopping by each night. Ethan, a young man in his late 20s, worked the night shift. For him, the gas station was a peaceful escape, offering solitude and a steady paycheck. But one night, during a torrential downpour, Ethan encountered something that would shatter his sense of reality. The storm began without warning. Thick clouds rolled in, and the rain came down in sheets, drowning out the usual hum of the night. Around midnight, Ethan was tidying up the counter when the lights began to flicker. The power had always been unreliable during storms, but tonight, the outages seemed almost deliberate. As Ethan stepped outside to check the pumps, a strange chill settled over him. The rain was freezing, and the wind carried an eerie whistling sound. He noticed a black car parked by pump 3. The driver was sitting still, staring straight ahead, completely motionless. Ethan grabbed an umbrella and walked toward the car. He tapped on the window, but the driver didn't respond. Lightning flashed, illuminating the interior. The driver's face was pale, eyes wide open in terror, as if frozen mid-scream. But what truly unnerved Ethan was the passenger seat. It was empty, yet there was a deep impression on the seat, as if someone invisible was sitting there. Rushing back to the station, Ethan locked the doors and called the local sheriff. As he explained what he'd seen, the line crackled with static, and a deep voice interrupted, "Do not interfere." Ethan froze. The voice wasn't human, it was guttural, almost otherworldly. The call disconnected, leaving only the sound of rain pounding on the roof. Moments later, the black car was gone. The next night, Ethan's friend Jake stopped by the station to keep him company. Ethan hesitated, but eventually told Jake about the strange events of the previous night. Jake, ever the skeptic, laughed it off, teasing Ethan about watching too many horror movies. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere grew heavier. The rain returned, and with it, the strange sense of unease. Around 2 a.m., the lights flickered again, and the sound of footsteps echoed from the dark road outside. Jake peered through the window and saw a figure standing in the rain, a tall man wearing an old-fashioned coat and hat. The man's face was obscured, but his presence felt suffocating. The encounter. Jake, curious and cocky, decided to confront the figure. Ethan begged him not to go, but Jake stepped outside anyway. The moment he did, the figure vanished. Jake turned back to the station, only to find the door locked from the inside. Ethan, panicking, tried to unlock the door, but it wouldn't budge. Through the glass, he saw Jake's expression change. Fear twisted his features as he looked over his shoulder. A shadowy figure loomed behind him, taller than any human should be. Lightning struck and the shadow was gone. Jake stumbled back inside, drenched and trembling. "There's something out there," he whispered. The chase. The two decided to leave the station and head to Jake's truck. As they ran through the rain, they heard whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all directions. The shadows in the woods moved unnaturally, closing in on them. Jake's truck wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died as if something was draining its power. Desperation took hold as the figures surrounded them, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. Just as one of the figures reached for Jake, a blinding light flooded the area. A passing trucker had stopped, his high beam scattering the shadows. The revelation. The trucker, an older man named Bill, seemed to know more than he let on. As they explained their ordeal, he nodded grimly. "You boys aren't the first to see them," he said. "This stretch of highway's been cursed for decades. People disappear, and those who survive are never the same." Bill offered to drive them into town, and they didn't hesitate to accept. But as they drove, Ethan noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. One of the shadowy figures was following them, running impossibly fast, even as the truck sped down the highway. The final confrontation. The figure caught up to them and slammed into the side, causing it to swerve. The truck came to a halt on the side of the road, and the three men scrambled out. The figure stood before them, its form now fully visible. It was humanoid, but distorted, with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift and blur. It pointed at Ethan and Jake, its voice echoing in their minds. "You saw what you weren't meant to see. Leave this place, or you'll never escape." Bill, armed with a shotgun, fired at the creature, but the bullets passed through it as if it were smoke. The creature advanced, but as lightning struck nearby, it recoiled, screeching in pain. Realizing its weakness, the three men ran toward the truck as lightning continued to light up the sky. They managed to escape, but the experience left them scarred. Ethan quit his job at the gas station, and Jake refused to drive that stretch of highway again. Weeks later, Ethan received an envelope, and inside was an old photograph of Ridgeway gas station, dated 1952. In the background, he saw the same shadowy figure standing among a group of workers, its glowing eyes unmistakable. To this day, neither man speaks of what happened, but on stormy nights, travelers claim to see shadowy figures along the highway, watching and waiting. The mystery of the stormy night. The curse of Thornwood House. The history of Thornwood House and Jack's obsession. Thornwood House wasn't just an abandoned home. It was a place steeped in mystery and death. Built in the late 1800s by industrialist Charles Thornwood, the house was meant to be a haven for his family. But what happened there turned it into the subject of chilling legends. Charles lived in the house with his wife, Mariette, and their young daughter, Ella. But one stormy night, both Mariette and Ella mysteriously disappeared. Some villagers whispered that Charles, in a fit of rage, had killed them, but no bodies were ever found. Days later, Charles himself was discovered dead in the house, his face twisted in terror. Since then, no one dared to live in Thornwood House. Those who ventured near often returned with harrowing stories, or didn't return at all. The villagers believed the house was cursed. Jack, a 35-year-old thrill-seeker and blogger who loved unraveling haunted mysteries, didn't believe in curses. To him, these stories were just superstitions. Determined to uncover the truth, Jack decided to spend a night in Thornwood House. Entering the house on a stormy night. That night, the sky was shrouded in thick, dark clouds. Thunder roared as rain pelted the earth, creating a foreboding atmosphere. Jack parked his car on the outskirts of the village and began walking toward Thornwood House, his flashlight guiding the way. The house stood in eerie silence, surrounded by dense woods. As Jack approached, the heavy wooden door creaked open with an unsettling groan. A cold gust of air greeted him as he stepped inside, almost as if the house itself was pulling him in. Dust coated the floors, cobwebs hung in every corner, and an awful stench permeated the air. Jack felt a shiver run down his spine, but shrugged it off. Just an old house, he muttered to himself, switching on his flashlight to explore further. The first signs. As Jack moved through the main hall, he noticed dried bloodstains on the floor. Deep scratch marks lined the walls, as though someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Jack froze. Probably just the wind, he rationalized. But a sense of unease crept over him as he cautiously ascended the creaking wooden stairs. At the top, he found a long hallway. At the far end was a slightly ajar door. Jack's curiosity got the better of him, and he pushed the door open. Inside was a small room with an old wooden table, and on it lay a red leather-bound diary. The diary's secrets. Jack picked up the diary and began to read. The first page sent a chill down his spine. If you're reading this, it means you're already part of this house. The house is alive, and it will consume you. Jack chuckled nervously, dismissing it as a prank. But as he flipped through the pages, he realized the diary belonged to Charles Thornwood. It described the final days of his life in harrowing detail. Charles had unearthed a strange stone while constructing the house. He wrote that the stone carried an ancient curse and was embedded in the foundation of the home. From that moment on, bizarre and horrifying events began to unfold, culminating in the disappearance of his wife and daughter. Jack's stomach tightened as he read. Before he could turn another page, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The horrors begin. Jack raced to the door and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the temperature in the room plummeted. Suddenly, a child's laughter echoed from somewhere in the room. Jack swung his flashlight around, but the room was empty. The laughter grew louder, morphing into something more sinister. Then, the walls of the room began closing in. Jack threw his weight against the door, and burst into the hallway, his heart pounding. The house's true nature. As Jack stumbled into the hallway, he realized it was no longer the same. The once familiar corridor now stretched endlessly, with blood dripping from the walls and strange footprints appearing on the floor. Out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw a figure, a woman in a tattered white dress with wild, unkempt hair. She stood silently at the end of the hallway, clutching something shiny. "Who are you?" Jack shouted, but his voice echoed unanswered. The woman began moving toward him, her movements unnatural and jerky. Jack tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the floor. He struggled until finally breaking free and bolted downstairs. The cursed stone. Jack recalled reading about the cursed stone in the diary. He realized it was the key to the house's malevolence. Determined to end the nightmare, he decided to find and destroy the stone, which was supposedly hidden in the basement. The basement door was heavy and rusted. As Jack descended the stairs, he felt an icy hand grip his shoulder. He spun around, but no one was there. At the bottom of the stairs, Jack found the stone resting on an old altar. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, and a dark, swirling mist surrounded it. He reached for the stone, but as soon as he touched it, the house trembled violently. The spirits of the house. Jack realized he wasn't alone. Shadowy figures emerged from the walls, their hollow eyes fixed on him. They whispered in unison, their voices dripping with malice. "You will never leave." Summoning all his courage, Jack grabbed a hammer lying nearby and swung it at the stone. The first strike sent a shockwave through the house. He struck again and again until the stone shattered. The shadows screamed and dissolved into nothingness. For a moment, it seemed as though the nightmare was over. The final twist. As Jack climbed back up the stairs, he noticed the house had changed once again. It was darker, colder, and more menacing than ever. The front door was now gone, replaced by a solid wall. Jack turned around and found himself face to face with the woman in white. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile as she whispered, "You thought it would be that easy." Epilogue: Thornwood House's endless hunger. The next morning, Jack's car was found abandoned near Thornwood House. His recorder, still in the passenger seat, held a chilling final message. "The house. It's alive. It's eating me. Don't come here. Don't." Thornwood House still stands today, waiting for its next victim. On stormy nights, passers-by claim to hear faint screams and see shadowy figures in the windows. The house's curse remains unbroken, its hunger insatiable. If you like the stories, please like the video, share with your friends and family, and don't forget to press the subscribe button and also press the bell icon to never miss the new chilling stories. Please mention in comment which story you liked most.